Hello, everyone. This is your host, Ali Hassam Al Haq. I'm the director for the Center for Law and Technology here at the Ziauddin University Faculty of Law, Politics and Governance. With me here today is the brilliant Professor Alex Lawson, the director for the Center of International and Constitutional Law. And the reason we're here today is because President Putin, the president of Russia, has indicated a change in Russia's policy regarding nuclear weapons. But before we come down to Russia's policy on nuclear warfare and nuclear weapons, Professor Lawson, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll pose the very rudimentary question to you that what are nuclear weapons and how many different types of nuclear weapons exist today?
Thank you, Ali. Yeah, it's interesting because people talk about nuclear weapons a lot, but maybe don't know what they are. Nuclear weapons use specific technologies. Basically, we talk now about using the hydrogen bomb, which involves kind of uncontrolled nuclear fusion at an atomic level, and produce these weapons produce enormous amounts of uncontrolled energy, essentially. And we measure how the size of a weapon in its equivalent to high explosives. So when a weapon is described as 1 megaton, that's equivalent to 1 million tons of TNT, of conventional explosives. And nuclear weapons produce various effects. And these vary depending on how you design the weapon. But first they produce explosive effects, which is explosive radiation. Then they produce heat. They also produce, relating obviously to heat, is a flash, intense light. And then they produce radiation, which is the more insidious thing that you can't see and eventually will affect you at a cellular level, so you're exposed to large amounts of radiation. If you're not killed by the massive explosion or burnt to death by the heat, you might be then irradiated by the fallout. And that leaves you with a very painful potential death, which is why, funnily enough, a lot of people, when they talk about nuclear weapons, say that if there was a nuclear attack, they'd like to be killed immediately, which we don't normally talk about in other forms of violence. But I'd like to be killed straight away. I'd just like to be vaporized because I don't want to die of radiation poisoning, which is one of the most painful ways to die. You can vary how those effects are produced depending on how you design the weapon.
I see.
But they all produce those effects.
So there's a lot of talk on tactical nukes. What's that all about?
Yeah, tactical nukes, we draw a distinction between strategic and tactical nukes. And it's an unfortunate phrase because it doesn't mean a lot, really, strategic versus tactical. But what it's come to mean over time is that basically larger weapons that you might use against something like a city, for example, are described as strategic. And those will be weapons that are measured in the megatons range. So anything between 1 and maybe 10 megatons. And then tactical nukes are just basically regarded as smaller nukes. And they're called, we're talking here about maybe 5 kilotons, which is the equivalent of 5,000 tons of TNT, or up to 750 kilotons, 750,000 tons of TNT. And they're described as tactical because you use them on the battlefield. So you wouldn't use them against something like a city or a naval base, say, in San Diego. We'd use them on the battlefield against a troop concentration.
I see. All right.
For example.
But which countries in the world are nuclear capable, have nuclear capacity to engage
Well,
in
obviously
nuclear warfare?
Russia, because we mentioned them already. And then it's the United States, the United Kingdom, I'm counting on my hand, France, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. Now, Israel is undeclared, but we're pretty clear that they do have them. And Pakistan and India, obviously, we know about that from 1998 onwards. And North Korea, we know, has nuclear weapons.
I see. But I mean, obviously, having nuclear weapons or a nuclear facility is a big responsibility for any state. How do they ensure the security, the physical security of these nuclear facilities?
Well, I mean, they go to great efforts to ensure the security of them. So in addition to the basic things like, having a big fence around the base and having guards patrolling, there's also some other safeguards. The way that nuclear weapons can be used is subject to safeguards. They're usually subject to very strict control, so it's not just a question of pressing a button and they fly off. Several people have to agree in the chain of command before they fly. If that varies from state to state, it can vary who has the ultimate say, whether it's the military or the civilian leadership. In the United States, it's the United States president who decides that. And then there are other people down the chain who have to agree. And then there are other safeguards, like, for example, if a nuclear weapon is owned by the United States but is on, say, the territory of Germany, both Germany and the United States have to agree to its use. That's called dual key agreement. So there are safeguards in place. Having said that, there is a problem that occurred particularly in the 1990s and has kind of gone away, but is still worth worrying about, I think, called loose nukes. And loose nukes was the idea that when the Soviet Union collapsed and became the successor state of Russia and other states, nuclear weapons were just unsecured. The state had collapsed, and there were nuclear weapons all over the Soviet Union. And the fear was that scientists and military personnel might just sell off nuclear weapons to the highest bidder, and the highest bidder might be Osama bin Laden, for example. Now, luckily that didn't happen because there was quite a strong system put in place by the United States to stop that from happening. The United States spent a lot of money to stop that phenomenon from happening. So that's the physical security. But of course, you're the director of technology. So what are the cyber aspects?
Oh, there's the huge cause of concern when it comes to digital security of critical infrastructure, as they call it. And case in point is Stuxnet, which was a computer virus designed by Israeli and U.S. intelligence, and it was discovered in 2010 following its attack on Iran's nuclear facilities. So what they essentially did was, even though this nuclear facility had an air gap, now an air gap essentially means that a facility is not directly connected to the internet. There is an air gap there. So there is a necessary next step to be taken for it to have connectivity. That's to ensure that there's no cyber warfare or cyber attacks made on that facility. However, the operatives, whoever was involved in the operation, utilized the weakest link, if I can call it that, which are the people working at the facility. So they somehow got one of the employees to put an unregulated or an unauthorized USB stick into their work computer, which is pretty much all they needed to do. And after that, Stuxnet infiltrated the entire nuclear facility. And what it started doing essentially was slowing down and speeding up the speed of the centrifuges and going beyond its safety parameters. So as a result, one by one, the centrifuges started failing. And the IAEA, actually, when it came to inspect the facilities, noticed that this disintegration or sort of the centrifuges failing isn't really following a fixed pattern. There's something that doesn't add up. And the investigations that followed this discovery is what uncovered Stuxnet. So yeah, there's a huge element of cybersecurity involved in these facilities, and obviously you're as strong as your weakest link. And so I believe that the people who are engaged in working at these facilities need to be trained and sort of taught the ins and outs of cybersecurity practices and secure practices to ensure that sort of events like these don't occur. Even if you have an air-gapped facility, if people aren't well trained, then I mean you're at the mercy of pretty much anybody who can take an unauthorized action. But I mean, we can discuss this a bit further as well. But I'd like to come back to the question when it comes to the law: is the use of nuclear weapons actually legal in the world today?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it depends who you ask. There is actually an anti-nuclear weapons treaty, which hardly anybody knows about. A treaty that bans the possession and use of nuclear weapons, and it's a proper treaty. It's a UN-sponsored treaty, and it's got lots of signatories. But the problem is that it's only agreed to by states that don't have nuclear weapons, which means that it's more or less meaningless. It's states that don't have and never will get nuclear weapons saying that they think nuclear weapons are illegal. So there's that problem. And none of the 9 states we mentioned have agreed to it. And quite a lot of states have also not agreed to it because they have American or other states' nuclear weapons on their territory, or because they're likely to reserve the right, at least, to develop nuclear weapons in the future. The other way of looking at it is that is there something in maybe customary international law that bans nuclear weapons that would apply to all states? And there was an advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice in 1996 called Threat or Use of Nuclear Weapons that maintained that the use of nuclear weapons would be illegal in almost all circumstances, but it left the door open that there might be a legal circumstance. Basically, because the effects of nuclear weapons are so horrendous and indiscriminatory that they're likely to cause loss of life to lots of civilians, even when they're used on a battlefield. I'll give you an example that they war-gamed a limited nuclear exchange, and they used Pakistan and India as a limited nuclear exchange, and they calculated that even in a fairly limited nuclear exchange between Pakistan and India, so not all of the nukes going off, 2 billion people will die on the planet, because lots of people will simply die, isn't it? I mean, everyone in Karachi is going to go, right? We're doomed. Yeah.
Yeah, well, let's hope not.
Yeah. Well, I'm saying if there's a nuclear war, right? But people in other parts of the world are just going to die of radiation poisoning and starvation and stuff like that.
You know, on this, I read a very interesting fact the other day that apparently people who are indigenous to this area, Pakistan, Sindh, even we have certain trace elements of radiation in our bodies that can be traced back to the disaster in Chernobyl.
Everybody in their body has elements from nuclear test explosions that you can find, and some of these are from nuclear tests in the 1950s and 1960s, before there was a comprehensive treaty banning tests of nuclear weapons. And we know exactly where these things came from, because some of these elements are elements that don't exist naturally. And you can actually type from the very specific chemical structure which bomb it came from, down to precisely which explosion actually caused it. Now, Chernobyl was not a nuclear explosion, but you're right, it produced the same thing, and we can say that came from Chernobyl because of very specific. I don't know exactly all the science, but you know,
it's fascinating to see that you can identify it down to the very bomb itself. So you very interestingly, you mentioned the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. There's another one, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Yeah.
So what international law regulates nuclear weapons? Are these two it, or are there more?
Well, firstly, there's the two things already mentioned. There's the treaty banning nuclear weapons, but it's only very limited in its effects, because none of the states that agree to it actually have nuclear weapons. And then there's the advisory opinion of the General Assembly, which is only an advisory opinion, is only customary international law, but maybe has some force. But then there is also, as you mentioned, there is a test ban treaty that's largely followed. Occasionally, some states do carry out nuclear tests, but it's quite rare nowadays. Most nuclear testing doesn't happen in the physical realm. It's done virtually now. You can usually test a device just using a computer simulation.
But what's the significance of testing? Why do countries test their weapons if they know the proof of concept exists, the weapon works?
The classic example is North Korea. North Korea tests nuclear weapons as a means of sending a signal to the world. So if, for example, the North Koreans are about to engage in some negotiations because they want more food, which is quite common because they're starving, then they will maybe do a nuclear test as a way of sending a message to America and South Korea and Japan and other states. So there's that, and unfortunately it is breached. And as you mentioned, there is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is designed to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. You can either be very optimistic or very pessimistic about this. You can say that since the NPT came in, there have only been 4 new nuclear weapons states, which would be Pakistan, India, North Korea, and Israel. Or you can be devastatingly pessimistic and say that's 4 new states have come in since the treaty. And the answer is that not every state has signed the treaty. Some states signed the treaty and left. North Korea is an example of that. And of course, if they sign the treaty and leave, there's nothing we can do about it.
It comes down to the very first episode we did on the enforcement of international law and the problems with that.
But states are free to sign treaties and renounce them. And they're not doing anything illegal by rescinding a treaty that they've agreed to. And of course, some states just never bothered signing it in the first place. And that meant that they weren't doing anything by the terms of that treaty illegal, because they weren't signatories to it, which is Israel's position.
Right. So speaking on the topic of illegality, now we'll come back to Russia, which is the entire reason we're having this conversation today. So in what way does President Putin suggest altering Russia's policy on nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I mean, Russia's policy on nuclear weapons has been set at a kind of official level for quite a long time. But President Putin in the last few years has had an interest in making people afraid of Russian nuclear use, because it's the great leveler. I mean, the Russian military is a large military. It's not basically as good as the militaries in the West. If there was a conventional conflict between Russia and NATO, Russia would lose. NATO is more advanced in many levels, and it's just a better military. The Russian military is conscript-based, and the conscript armies tend to not be very good. But what President Putin keeps saying is that essentially what we call the threshold for nuclear use keeps getting lower, right? So traditionally, the threshold for nuclear use would be that you were attacked yourself by a nuclear weapon, right? In which case you reserve the right to respond. Or you might say, we're not going to wait to be attacked, but if we think that there's a very high possibility that a nuclear war is about to break out, we reserve the right to essentially start the nuclear war.
It's a preemptive self-defense.
Yeah, preemptive kind of self-defense, yeah. Launch on warning is another phrase you sometimes hear, which is that you launch your missiles once you believe with a high degree of confidence that the other side have or are about to launch theirs. Obviously, there's a risk of miscalculation here. But what President Putin does, he keeps lowering the threshold and saying, well, we would consider this to be a threat.
Kind of reminds me of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, exactly. You know, and well, this is it's brinkmanship, and of course the main problem we have with this whole scenario is we have no data because this never happened. There have been only 2 uses of nuclear weapons ever, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that was a monopoly situation where only one side had them, and Japan just really didn't know what was happening. They were just nuked, you know, and then they were nuked again, and then they surrendered. But we have no data of what would happen in a scenario where 2 nuclear-powered states, nuclear-armed states, are facing off against each other. We don't know what people would do, whether they would respond, you know, die for their country, stand on a point of principle, or just give in and say anything's better than the end of civilization, you know. So what President Putin's doing is, the most recent statement is not that coherent, but he's essentially saying that if, for example, the United States supplies missiles to Ukraine, and those missiles are used against Russian targets, and we're talking about conventional missiles, Russia would consider that supply of a conventional weapon by a nuclear-powered state as justifying nuclear use.
I see.
Right? It's a quite complicated explanation, but it's a way of saying, you know, we will resort to nuclear weapons sooner than you previously thought we would. Right. Now, whether you can take this seriously or not, I don't know. But I think that, you know, yeah, you should take it seriously.
But Russia has made a number of similar threats, and they've indicated their nuclear capacity and the willingness to sort of use that, especially in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So, I mean, how much weight would you give to this statement now? And does this change in policy actually make the use of nuclear weapons more likely, in your opinion?
I think the only sensible answer to that is yes, because you've got somebody with a large nuclear stockpile, and Russia has pretty much the largest nuclear stockpile in the world. We're talking potentially thousands of weapons with enough destructive power to pretty much kill everybody.
And the largest nuclear warhead too.
Yeah. Well, there's always been a Russian tendency in everything to build big, you know, so they build big rockets, big nuclear power stations, big dams, and big nukes. And so I think the only sensible answer is if somebody who's got all those nuclear weapons is talking more about using them and quite freely, breaking what we call the nuclear taboo, which is discussing the use of nuclear weapons openly, then that increases the risk of nuclear war. The question is, does it increase the risk of nuclear war enough that we should be worried about it? You know, it might have increased the chances of nuclear war, made it 3 times more likely. And that's a terrifying statistic. But if the chance of nuclear war was 1 in a million, and now it's 1 in 300,000, that's still not. It's a lot more.
Significantly
it's significantly more, but it's still very unlikely.
Very unlikely.
Right. And so that would be my answer. That yes, it has definitely increased the chance of nuclear war, but it remains extremely unlikely.
I see. So for a layperson like me, and I call myself a layperson because you're the expert in international relations and warfare and nuclear warfare and strategy, but the idea of mutually assured destruction seems to be the only, or one of the only, if not the only, thing that's maintaining peace and security all over the world. And this concept, just for our listeners to understand, is that when 2 states are both nuclear armed, they know that their sort of survival in the long term depends on the fact that they don't engage in nuclear warfare with the other state that's nuclear armed. And like you said, the only example we have in the world is of America and Japan, where Japan, it was asymmetric because
Yeah.
Japan is not a nuclear power state. So is the concept of mutually assured destruction strong enough to ensure the continued peace and security in the world, or is there a point in time where you genuinely believe we should perhaps be worried about it? Like you said, like, if we do engage in a nuclear all-out warfare, it would be devastating for all of humanity. You know, not just the two countries involved because of, like you mentioned, the radiation. And you know, if nuclear test radiation is present in all of our bodies today from 1950, now we're at 70 odd years in the future from that point in time. So, I mean, I think that the consequence of such a thing would be devastating for civilization. But is there a point where, in time, where you feel we should genuinely be worried? And then also, in your answer, please comment on the doomsday clock.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll do both of those. Mutual assured destruction may have worked. We say it may have worked. We don't know, because there was never never has been a global nuclear war. So you can say, well, that some people say mutually assured destruction worked, but that isn't proof at all, because it may not have happened for all kinds of reasons. There simply may have never been a reason for there to be a nuclear war. In other words, it just never got that bad, and that's a perfectly plausible explanation. The problem is that mutual assured destruction relies on basically the President of the United States deciding that a Russian nuclear use requires a massive response. Now, if there are 1,000 nuclear warheads heading to the United States, the President of the United States will respond with everything. But that's not very likely. It's much more likely there'll be like a single use of a very small device in Ukraine. And it just seems unrealistic that that would trigger a massive response, because it just doesn't seem proportionate, exactly. And also, it's not a NATO member state, and it's not the United States, and they're the main nuclear power. There are other nuclear powers in NATO. So it's what we call salami tactics. It's the idea that instead of forcing your opponent into a situation where they'd have to respond with a full nuclear exchange, you take a small slice, a little bit of territory, and the other side, well, we can't justify responding massively to that. Or maybe the small slice is a small use of a nuclear device on Ukrainian territory. And again, President Biden has kind of suggested that a small nuclear use on Ukraine would not lead to a nuclear response. It would lead to a conventional response against Russia. But the Russians are probably likely to even see that as an escalation, and then they might move to use nuclear weapons against NATO targets, and then you're into the whole escalation disaster. So I think mutual assured destruction may have worked, but it doesn't really make sense in the current environment, where a single use just doesn't seem likely to trigger a full response. But it might down the line. I think we're looking at a situation that would deteriorate into eventually full nuclear use.
So we want to avoid escalation, essentially.
Yeah, and escalation is a word that comes up again and again. And then secondly, you asked about the doomsday clock. I mean, this is the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists who've had the doomsday clock since the 50s, and they move it. I mean, this is not a government body, it's an independent body. And they move it towards midnight. Midnight is nuclear war.
Right.
And at the moment, I don't know where it is now, you can look it up on the internet, but it sort of varies between 11:45 and midnight. They've never had it really low. They're pretty pessimistic, because there's this view that if you just have nuclear weapons, eventually there'll be an accidental use or something. And so when it's like at 11:58, you're supposed to panic. And when it's like 11:45, you're not supposed to panic. There's also, I think they've started to think of it not just in terms of nuclear use as well, and global warming has started to become something that they factor in, so that midnight is just, the end of civilization. It's fun to look at the nuclear doomsday clock. I'm not convinced that it's necessarily that helpful, but yeah, That's what it is.
It's kind of illustrative of the human perception of risk.
Yeah.
So Paul Slovic writes about the perception of risk, and he says that we don't, as humans, we're not very good thinking in terms of mathematical statistics. We're terrible. If
Yeah,
anything,
no, we're terrible. Yeah.
our intuition is completely, 180 degrees separate from what statistics indicate. So what Slovic talks about is that we don't focus on the likelihood of something happening. We focus more on the consequence or the
Yeah.
magnitude of the consequence after a certain thing happens. Which is why when a survey was taken, majority of people, lay people, said that nuclear weapons and nuclear technology is way more risky or dangerous than, say, driving a car,
Yeah.
which is statistically very untrue
Yeah.
because we've had a lot more deaths and injuries related with driving cars than we have with nuclear warfare. And this just goes to show that in our perception, it's just that a single event, but when it's a big event, has a greater impact on us psychologically than small events happening, millions of times, perhaps every year or every uh, month or so on. So yeah, that's I think revealing of our sort of
No, I
perception of
mean,
that.
you're exactly right. It's I think people think in terms of a combination of likelihood and then consequences, and they get them mixed up. And the likelihood of there being a conflict in the world is 100%. There are always going to be conflicts. The likelihood of there being a nuclear conflict is lower. But of course, the likelihood of there being a nuclear conflict, the consequences are so much worse. But you're exactly right. I mean, risk is not the same thing as uncertainty. Uncertainty is perfectly valid. And most people can deal with uncertainty. Risk, they can't. If I tell you that smoking cigarettes increases your chance of lung cancer by 3 times, people go, oh, that's terrible, that's a disaster, I'm going to die. Your chance of getting lung cancer are like 1 in 150,000, right? So now they're 1 in 50,000. Again, don't smoke, because that's still a higher risk, but it's still not very likely.
Fair enough. But there's also been a lot of discussion regarding a complete nuclear disarmament, and we're talking the Global Zero Initiative and this sort of counter narrative emerging from society, from people who would like to consider themselves as pacifists or even not. How realistic do you think that goal actually is?
No chance.
Yeah.
The problem is that, I mean, President Obama was big on this, but all he did was make speeches. In fact, he actually initiated the recapitalization of America's nuclear arsenal by the time he left office, under pressure from Congress, in exchange for getting lower numbers in treaties with Russia, lower numbers of warheads. He had to agree to have better, newer warheads. The problem is that the actual science and even the resources are not complicated. To build nuclear weapons, it's easy. North Korea has nuclear weapons. You couldn't imagine a more backward, poor, starving state than North Korea, right? And it was able to build nuclear weapons. They're just too easy to make. And if you got to global zero, it would only last until some bad guys decide to build a nuclear device. Also, there's a feeling that the closer you get to zero, sometimes people talk about 500 warheads as being a magic figure, that below a certain threshold of warheads, how you use them starts to make a difference. When there are thousands of warheads, it doesn't really matter how you use them because eventually the net effect is going to be the same, right? But if you get to a certain figure, it might incentivize states to attack, because if they use their weapons smartly, they can win. And then if you got to zero, what if 2 years into your global zero, there's a big crisis and Israel decides to build a nuclear bomb again, which it can do, in a week. And suddenly the only power in the world with a nuclear device is Israel.
Right.
Or you substitute any other state for that.
Well, I see the concern with that. Makes sense. But that leads me to my next question, which is that if it is arguably relatively easy to build a nuclear weapon, how come we haven't seen more states becoming nuclear powers after the 4 that you mentioned: Pakistan, India, Israel, and North Korea?
There's been a lot of work to try and stop it from happening, mostly by the United States. So the United States, for example, South Korea was talking recently about developing a nuclear deterrent of its own. And the Biden administration put a lot of effort into reassuring South Korea that it didn't need to do it by giving it more conventional weapons aid and assuring it that it was still protected by the US, what we call nuclear umbrella. So there's been a lot of effort put into that. I still think that more nuclear states is likely down the road. I think there are some states that probably will do it. A lot of states are encouraged to just stay at the level of they could build a nuclear weapon, but they're strongly discouraged from doing it and given incentives not to. And there are a lot of states like that, which could build a nuclear weapon within a week and have the means to deliver it as well. And I'm not talking about Iran, I'm talking about states like Taiwan, well, sorry, Taiwan's not a state, but Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Brazil, not necessarily states you regard as rogue or dangerous in any sense. And they're sort of encouraged, well, just stay where you are,
Maintain the status quo.
Exactly. And there are some states in the Middle East that possibly could do the same thing, could build a nuclear device quite quickly. They're given strong incentives to stay where they are, but they know in the back of their mind that if they absolutely have to, they can build nuclear. If you take into account the number of states in the world that are in that position, you increase the number of nuclear weapon states to maybe 30.
Right. Well, that's quite concerning, actually.
Well, if you think that Sweden doesn't have the technology to build a nuclear device, of course it does. It just doesn't because of its historic sort of reputation as being neutral. And Switzerland, of course, they could build a nuclear bomb. They've got the money and the resources. But Switzerland just doesn't do that kind of thing. So
the capacity exists, but the necessity is not
it's
there.
not complicated. If you read, I remember reading Tom Clancy's novel, The Sum of All Fears, which, spoiler alert, involves a nuclear bomb. There's a film made about it. And in that, at the end of the book, he actually says, I changed some of the details because I didn't want people to know how to build a nuclear bomb.
Oh dear.
But actually, it's very easy to find out how to do it. But he said he felt guilty precisely explaining it. So he kind of precisely explains it with a few bits missing.
I see.
But it's something you could go on the internet and learn.
I would not recommend that to anybody listening, because you'll be on like 10,000
well, exactly,
watch
lists and stuff.
You're going to be
you need
world
things
of
like the fissile material, which is difficult to get, but not impossible. And you need some technology, but it's not, it's not that difficult.
Well, I mean, I'm definitely leaving this episode more concerned than I was entering it. But thank you so much, Professor Lawson. I think your insight has been very valuable and quite exploratory and revealing of the multifarious considerations and other practical elements surrounding nuclear weapons, their use, their regulation, their non-proliferation, how the status quo is being maintained, how peace and security can be maintained. So I suppose I can only conclude this episode on the wish and the prayer and the hope that the status quo remains as it is, and there's nothing drastic that happens that creates, like you said, the necessity for these 30-odd states to also become, able to use nuclear weapons. So yeah, thank you so much for your time today, and looking forward to having you with us next week.
Thank you, Ali.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.